Ta-da, did that work, I hope?
We got it.
Looks like, thank you. Well, thank you for Wetlands Watch for having me, especially Ian, lining this up. Thank you. And thank you to all of you all for attending, because as I said earlier, I plan to ask you for feedback. So I hope you're in a talkative mood today, because I really want the potential users of this guide to be speaking up and telling me what's helpful and what's not. So a little my background, I used to run the Coastal Policy Center at William & Mary Law School. Then I came over and was, scarily enough, the inaugural practitioner fellow for the UVA Environmental Institute. And they asked me, what would you like to research? And I said, I feel like the concept of what we do in the face of climate change to build our resilience and things including managed retreat has become so politicized that we are kind of losing sight of the forest for the trees, and that in reality, local governments have been planning to address risk for a long time. It's just that climate change is a huge risk and it's built out over a longer period of time, a shorter period of time for some of us. And so how can we look at it as simply a spectrum of proactive planning is needed to plan for resilience? And these are the steps you can take along the way. In some cases, yes, in the most extremely vulnerable areas, you're going to need to look at moving away from the risk. That's just the reality of it. But there are other steps that a community can take along the way. And I was interested in looking at how do we talk about tools that are available for communities to help have community-led planning. So I started talking to some stakeholders, some colleagues, and I heard back a number of times, white papers are nice, but sometimes they end up on the shelf and aren't as helpful as a hands-on guide could be, something that is more user-friendly. And so that's why the project pivoted in midstream from a white paper to an online guide. I want to say thank you up front to Sea Grant for hosting it and for providing lovely photos for it, and particularly Jay Clark, who's the communications director, who did such a great job helping to lay out this whole thing. And it's a lot of information to try to distill down in a user-friendly format. Just ask MC and Ian. They can tell you that they deal with this all the time, I'm sure. So all the feedback you can give me about how this can be more user-friendly would be really welcome. So I'm going to start out by showing you that there are really two ways to deal with this guide to access the various parts of it. One is across the top. We've got the home screen, which is this one, which has got all of the icons. I like to call them bubbles on it, if you like the more visual approach. Or you can go to the top and across, we've got these accordion drop-down sections that you can access. So I'm going to start in the very beginning with something I really want your feedback on. And by the way, this doesn't have to be right now either. There's a form that you can fill out at the top that says contact us. And that's a form you can fill out to send feedback that I'll get. So thank you. There's also a search icon there too. So if you have anything you're looking for, you can go to it that way as well. But one thing that I want to point out is that in the Coastal Resilience Master Planning process, the first Technical Advisory Committee, there was a Resilience and Studies Subcommittee. Mary Carson and I were on it together. And one of the tasks that was assigned to us was to develop a relocation guide for local governments. And that was never finalized. It didn't come to fruition, but it shows that it was thought that there was a need for some kind of a guide for local governments. It wasn't really clear exactly what was intended with that guide. So I started asking people what would they like to see in this one, and a couple folks mentioned that and said, it'd be helpful if you could put up front some points that locality staff can show to their elected officials or to their community leaders to show them about some of the issues that are at play here when you're talking about adaptation and resilience. So I start out with an executive summary, just saying, what does this guide do? It provides some best practices for talking about resilience in communities and helping it to be a community-led process. Who are the intended users of the guide? It's intended to assist local elected officials, government staff, and community leaders undertaking resilience planning. And why use this guide? Because everybody's facing ultimately the same needs: to identify your risks and vulnerabilities, consider potential distinct impacts on at-risk, particularly vulnerable communities, plan solutions with full community input and participation, I'm singing to the choir here, you know better than I, make really difficult decisions on what to save, when and how to fund everything. So, the main goal here is to provide tools, to provide resources, to provide information, and to help people to avoid inaction, which is sometimes a politically more palatable choice, to be honest, but it doesn't help you in the long run because then you get into a reactive mode at some point instead of a proactive mode. So this is where I put some kind of main points to know about adaptation planning. I just gave it a plain English title. If you all have a snazzier title, to things we want to show to elected officials or community leaders, whatever it is. I just wanted to say things you need to know about adaptation planning. So I start out talking about what the state has done, just to give people a background that may not have it. What is resilience? That sounds like kind of a silly question to ask, but you find out when you get down in the trenches and work on resilience that people have different definitions. And this is to prompt people to think broadly about resilience. The first thing folks often mention, and rightfully so, is what's the emergency response plan look like, which is key. But, it's also infrastructure, it's community health, it's economic concerns. I give an example of the Resilience Adaptation Feasibility Tool Project, the RAFT, which is a project that UVA does with ODU and Virginia Tech, where we work with communities on resilience, and we define that resilience very broadly to cover social and economic and natural resilience. So trying to broach that topic to get people to think about that. Noting that adaptation doesn't have to be a sudden upheaval. You can do it step by step as part of a holistic planning process. And then noting and stressing that it's a very community-specific process. The planning depends upon the situation, the context, and the fiscal situation of the community. So there are a lot of factors at play there. Going into that, talk a little bit about communities needing to determine what their tipping points are. I want to give a shout out to the Bay program, the Climate Resilience Work Group. I took this to them and put the concept by them, and they said, some folks said, we really like the idea of tipping points. And others said, we really don't like that idea. It doesn't resonate with us and the communities we work with. One person up in Maryland said, a community they were working with said, we have no idea what our tipping points are. We just think we'll know what they are when we get there. So help us plan so that we're ready when it does happen, that we have plans in place that can kick in. So that's a really difficult dilemma, I think. We have a case study about adaptation planning, and I think that that's something that communities really have to face individually. Each community will be different in their priority setting. And so this is where we go into the adaptation pathways approach to try to describe one approach to doing that. And then you'll notice that the last one that I put there is moving out of harm's way, because that is something that has to be faced in some extremely vulnerable areas, but there are other things you can do first in the meantime. But it's important to note that in some cases, you're just buying time. And so using that time wisely is one of the challenges for local communities to figure out what they want to do with that time that they've bought. And then I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the folks who helped me and gave me some advice and review of portions of this guide. Natalia Artus with Atlantic Union Bank was great in talking about the Community Reinvestment Act, which is a newer tool that I'm going to show you in a moment. Ian, thank you. Anna Maria Bookvik from Virginia Tech, Matt Dallin from the state, from DCR, Troy Hartley, Director of Sea Grant, Carolyn Heaps-Picaro, also with DCR, and Louis Lawrence and Ben McFarland from our PDCs, Middle Peninsula and HRPDC, Dr. Molly Mitchell with VIMS, Kristen Owen, Henrico, Mary Carson, thank you, Dr. Jessica Whitehead with ODU, and Dr. Wee Yusuf with ODU, and as I noted, the Chesapeake Bay Climate Resiliency Work Group, and Will Eisenberg with the CZM program. So I'm going through that list, A, to say thank you, and B, to show you how many folks from different walks provide valuable input on the resilience issues. So for the contents, I'm going to show you that in a moment. I think I'm going to skip quickly, and let me reiterate, if there are things that you think I should add or take away from that drop-down accordion menu of topics that seem like I tried to figure out what are background issues that it would be helpful for people to know as they launch into this in their community. Are there other things that should be added? Please speak up. We're gonna, I think, have Q&A at the end, and there's also that form that I just showed you. So either way, please let me know if you think there are things that should be added or subtracted. I'm gonna flip to the legal considerations tab. Again, this is something that kind of came out of when we were writing that for the Resilience and Studies Subcommittee of the Coastal Resilience TAC, that I was asked to think about the legal aspects to write something up. That didn't come out, but it got me thinking about, there are some Virginia-specific legal considerations that we need to think about as we're doing resilience planning. You all know all about the Dillon Rule. You live this joy every day. So I don't need to go into that too much, but it may be that it's helpful to some of your community leaders to learn about that when you're talking about what can we do as a community. Private property rights, eminent domain, downzoning, takings concerns, shifting property lines in the face of shifting shorelines. Independent cities, a lot of folks don't think about the fact that Virginia is unusual because we have these independent cities. That means separate budgets, separate capital improvement plans, separate bonding capacity, separate comp plans. It means harder to do regional planning. And so that's one of the background issues. And then this is, I'm laughing because I've already run this by Mary Carson and Ian, and they're probably tired of hearing of it. But trying to get rolling easements more into Virginia. Kudos to Wetlands Watch for leading the way with the Elizabeth River Project one. Thinking along those lines about voluntary rolling easements, could they be used as a proffer in a vulnerable area? We know that the General Assembly curtailed the use of proffers some time ago, but they are still allowed in some circumstances when truly related to the development. And so is this a way to crack the door? We don't have an express authority in state law right now to use rolling easements, but could this crack the door towards getting there through their voluntary use as proffers? So if that works, you can call it the Andrews Voluntary Rolling Easement Proffer. If it doesn't, I don't know where you got the idea. So onward and upward. Case studies, we did some individual case studies to go into detail about the adaptation pathways approach in Cuba, what they're doing, the Room for the River program in the Netherlands, where people are actually moving out of the way of the river. It's pretty phenomenal. And then the wampum framework is a framework for working with Indian tribes and how they approach things. I'm going to now skip to step 1 to show you the heart of the guide, really, the 5 steps that you go through. In each case, we tried to lay it out similarly for all the steps so that people get kind of used to the way it's laid out. Step 1 is the initial assessment and community-led prioritization. Again, a lot of info, so we did these accordion, I think that's the official name, the drop-down menus, the accordion menus. And so for each one, we've got some additional info in this step 1, assess the locality's existing plans. What do you already have? And it's a gaps analysis, really. And then, what are your risks? What are your gaps? And engage the full community in establishing your planning timeline and priorities. And that's where it gets really community specific, right? That's where every community is going to be different in their funding, their timeline, their priorities. And so just talking about things like the need to define resilience, resilient community, social resilience, defining it up front so everybody knows what you're talking about and has a common understanding, connecting with community leaders and trying to understand each communities or neighborhoods, culture, and history. And building trust takes time, as all of us know. It doesn't happen overnight. So that has to be written into your plan, and it takes so long. You can't just say, oh, we'll give it 6 months, right? Building trust with communities takes a long time. And consider creating, you can divide it up into these adaptation areas that you're going to focus on. And so we list some here of all the different things you can look at. You could consider creating stakeholders committees to assist with each of your focal areas, and talks about different methods that you can use to obtain community feedback and some suggestions about tools that you can look at and what others have done. and how to publicize and build partnerships and best practices to keep in mind. And then some community engagement specific concerns. As you can see, there's a lot of information in here. The 6 key principles of equitable collaboration and where to go for more information on that. And then kind of a case study from Maine about what they did to obtain accurate demographic data. They found that was challenging, in particular in areas with transient workforces, to get accurate demographic data. And the raft and some examples of successful community engagement. Step 2 would be when you go to your actual strategy development. And this is actually the step that has the most information. We really had to put the thinking cap on of how to divvy this up into digestible components and have people figure out how to get through all this information. So I'll point out I'll talk in a moment about the 3 approaches that we narrowed it to. And these tabs across the top will take you to each approach, or further down the page, you can go directly to them as well. So the actions are: assess the options available to address those risks you've already determined and those vulnerabilities, and take into account your budget, priorities, tipping points, timeline, and changing conditions that you're facing. I give an example there of the city of Alexandria and how they were designing their combined sewer overflow system to accommodate the expected flooding through the year 2100. Engage your community to develop strategies to address each of your adaptation focus areas. And again, I list those up here. Again, infrastructure, social resilience, health and well-being, economy, emergency planning response, historic, cultural, natural resources. Engage with them to develop a strategy in each of these topics and conduct a feasibility assessment to see what you can do. And essentially, in very vulnerable areas, governments have 3 choices. You can reduce or prevent development that's already there. You can try to make safer the development. Sorry, you can reduce or prevent development coming there. You can make safer the development that's already there. Or you can relocate residents and businesses away when the risk becomes too great. And so we broke that into the 3 approaches. And we note that as your conditions change, your strategies and plans need to be revisited periodically. And that's the last step, step 5. And looking for best practices, we list those here. And then community engagement concerns, again, just like with step 1. And here we go into more detail with the 3 approaches. Approach 1, reducing risk by limiting development, preserving green space in high-risk areas. 2 would be reducing your risk with mitigation and adaptation measures for existing development. And 3 is, when that's not enough, planned relocation away from the risk. So you can get to each of these pages by clicking on these orange tabs, or at the top of that page where we had listed the approach 1, 2, and 3. And then we talk a little bit about some innovative ideas. I go into Wetlands Watch's rolling easement I go into the proffers, and the bill put in about the potential reuse of religious organizations' unused land. That went back and forth. I'm hoping that might come back, because that's a great way to reuse some urban land that's not being used to provide affordable and safe housing on higher ground in some cases. Just presenting some innovative ideas. If we go to approach 1 in developing your strategy, this is to reduce the people at risk by limiting development and preserving green space in vulnerable areas, high-risk areas. And we talk about the comprehensive plan and various statutory and regulatory measures that can be used. Creation of ag and forestal districts, conservation and open space easements, TDRs, density bonuses, Ches Bay Preservation Act, tree protection ordinances, trying to lay out in one spot, kind of one-stop shopping, a bunch of the tools that can be used. Now I'll go to the top of the page and just click on approach 2, which is reducing risk for existing development and infrastructure. And there we talk about reducing risk to buildings, to other infrastructure, historic and cultural heritage sites, and green and gray infrastructure specifically. I'm going to go to historic and cultural sites and cultural heritage sites because I think that that's not only interesting, but it's often a little harder to find consolidated information on those. Um, and so we talk about there are three things really you could do with very threatened historic sites. You can either modify them, which, you modify and you risk losing historic status in some cases with some buildings, relocating them, same problem, or abandoning them with documentation. So I like to say that unfortunately, none of these are great options and they're all going to cost money, but it's what we're facing in extremely vulnerable areas. The three photos on the right were taken by me, so a very non-professional photographer, of Mandeville, Louisiana, which is a community across Lake Pontchartrain from New Orleans that faces severe flooding in an historic district. And they found they were ending up with these stairs going right up the middle, 20 steps, or garages facing the front of the property. They got concerned about how it looked, but they wanted people to be safe, so they developed some design guidelines. So the garage doors have to be on the side of the back of the house. The stairs come up and then up and various things. So that may be of interest to communities with flood prone areas where they're trying to maintain the historic district in place for as long as they can, but modify it as they can as well to keep it safe. Newport, Rhode Island, the Point neighborhood is a very sad story because it was a neighborhood relocated with Doris Duke's money. It was in the way of a highway. And now it's flooding from sea level rise. And so they're a threat again. They are elevating their homes again with guidelines. I went on a walking tour with a docent and it was very attractive, but the poor lady, I asked her, but what about the fact that the streets are still flooding? And she said, yep, it's a problem. We have to park blocks away. But what we're trying to do is work with a neighborhood uphill to get them to reduce their stormwater runoff. So too many times in our low-lying communities, there is no uphill, but there are things to do to work with surrounding areas, but some case studies that might have helpful information. And then the final option is relocation, and we give some case studies about that as well and how that was handled with some historic structures. Abandonment is, really the hardest choice. I went to the Keeping History Above Water conference down in St. Augustine, Florida, and a speaker was there from Scottish um, heritage, and he said, we know we're an island nation. We know we can't save everything. So we are making choices about a few of these coastal castles to save, and the rest we're just going to have to leave to nature and put a sign up. Really, really tough decision. And you all are often in the front lines on that. And so just pointing out what others have done, but that doesn't make it any easier when you have to do it. But just trying to provide you with some information and helpful resources, and then again with cemeteries and an example from Maryland. So I'm going to go quickly back up here to approach 3. How am I doing on time? Doing okay. And approach 3 is when mitigation and adaptation measures are not enough and you've got to move away from the risk. Here are some important considerations. That it might be helpful to show members of the community to talk about how best to handle this and how best to respect the cultures we're talking about. If you are talking about relocating people away from risk, one thing that can be helpful is to talk about relocating them away to an area that's safer within the same locality. That not only helps the locality to retain the tax base, which is a serious concern, but it also means that it helps them to preserve the residents to preserve their social and cultural ties more when they're not moving far away. So planning for receiving areas where you can, it can actually be a very helpful thing to do to allay people's concerns. And so then we talk about things like the decision to move or not and when, and ensuring that there's affordable, safe housing in receiving communities, that we're not pricing people out of safe housing. Buyouts as a tool, redevelopment or relocation of socially vulnerable communities, and some challenges and pitfalls to avoid. So when you're in that very unhappy circumstance of having to actually pull away from an area, just trying to get the information and the tools out there. The National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine produced a really interesting community-driven relocation report that's helpful as well. So we talk about that and give you a little synopsis of portions of that. And we have some case studies Grundy, Virginia, a famous one. And then talk about the Norfolk Resilience Quotient and Comprehensive Plan. And ensuring safe housing is an intriguing one because it brings into play things like a land bank and community benefit agreements. Again, a very unprofessional photograph taken by me, but it's in a neighborhood in Louisiana that flooded terribly in that unnamed 2016 storm event. And the realty sign says did not flood. That's how they were advertising houses. This one didn't flood. Come by this one. Yeah, that's what we want to avoid. This one about charitable donation triggered tax deductions. I think I saw Jackie here. It's about the Middle Peninsula Chesapeake Bay Public Access Authority and the 30-some properties that have been donated that are often vulnerable properties that can give a tax benefit to the owner, get them out of a hazardous situation, and enable public access at the same time. Buyouts, we have some case studies. New Jersey Blue Acres program is a very well-known one. Locally funded one in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina. That's a really interesting one to look at. A Texas Green Bond down in Harris County, and then Henrico is on it and working with that as well. Buyouts with redbacks is another concept that's floated out there. People in vulnerable areas, a local government might buy out some homes and then rent them back as holiday homes if it's in a beach area, or allow senior citizens to keep living there and buy back for the rest of their life, rent back, I should say, with the understanding that the heirs won't get it upon the death of the senior citizens living there. Give some case studies about relocation of socially vulnerable communities. Some pitfalls to avoid. Heirs property is a very big issue in the South in particular, where African American families post-Civil War, when they acquired property, they may not have had a written will that clearly said, they may not have known a lawyer or trusted a lawyer in their community. And so property that is known to be owned by a family, a pool of people within a family, but not one specific person, can pose some challenges, and that needs to be acknowledged and dealt with. FEMA had to deal with that with giving out post-hazard funding. So it's important to keep those in mind. And then beyond easements, just noting that easements can be very useful, but it's really for people who are in a position where they can accrue tax credits, and that's not everyone. Leaves out renters and owners of lots that are too small to accommodate easements. So localities can use easements as just one among a diverse array of tools to try to make sure that we aren't missing other things that are available. I'm going to go back up to the top and take you to step 3, which is detailed planning, and it's develop an adaptation action plan. And the actions: develop a detailed plan with your timeline and costs for implementing the strategies, group the options into long-term and short-term, make sure you're continuing to take vulnerable communities into account, and assess your staff capacity to manage the implementation of the plan. Because as everyone knows, it takes one pool of money to develop a plan and a whole different pool of money to implement it. And so trying to look ahead to funding sources for that. Some best practices and community engagement concerns. Again, helpful tools and resources. And sample resilience plans in Virginia. A shout out to DCR staff for helping me to come up with some examples to just show that people could come and check out here. And then a case study, again, referring to the wampum framework. So helpful tools and resources. These are ones specific to this step, but we have a tools and resources tab. When I showed this to the Association of Coastal PDCs, one person said, this alone makes this worthwhile, because we pulled together a bunch of different tools and resources. I will say, obviously, we are in a state of transition right now. Some of these federal tools are being taken down. So I'm kind of letting things calm down a little bit right now before figuring out which ones are not posted any longer. But each of these drop down or accordion um, pleats in the menu here, has a bunch of tools that we've put in here. Including Wetlands Watch's adaptation guide, by the way. And then here's some for heat expressly and for predicting risks, economic risks and vulnerabilities, funding, and there's a whole funding step I'm going to show you in a moment. But this is, you can see like this is specifically the US Chamber of Commerce, a tool aimed at businesses, Insurance Institute, DHS, Business Resources, funding, how to help a community identify and engage with their vulnerable communities. Start off with VIMS's interactive map on the Adapt VA website. It's got a social vulnerability layer that you can look at. That's a handy tool. Community engagement tools, green infrastructure, lots on green infrastructure, as you can tell. And historic and cultural site preservation and cemetery preservation. Step 4, I know you all want me to talk about that. Show me the money, right? Funding and financing sources. Again, the approach of actions. But here I put in like a mini table of contents because there are so many different funding and financing elements we want to cover. So we have actions, best practices when seeking funding, some challenges that we spell out, and then some major funding and financing categories. And some folks who are out in the field that are living this all the time, like Louis Lawrence, the Middle Peninsula PDC, because of his loan and grant programs, gave me some helpful tips and information. We're trying to point out some of the considerations about funding to keep in mind, that FEMA NFIP funding can be insufficient. Funding may not be available to assist all vulnerable residents due to cost-benefit analyses in federal programs. And sometimes people talk about, why don't you get grant funds to this small community within a locality, but that community is not actually an entity that can apply for funding themselves. So that has to be kept in mind as to who applies for funding for them. You got to get your timing right for funding, how quickly you can get money to people. Environmental gentrification can result from resilience-driven value additions to property. So that's just a consideration to keep in mind. I wanted to scroll down here to and various kinds of bonds, EIBs, municipal bonds, catastrophe and resilience bonds, taxes and fees, TIFs, stormwater utility fees, service districts. And we talked a bit about parametric insurance. That is not used regularly in Virginia. The RISE competition this past time around was about trying to bring parametric insurance to Southwest Virginia. They've also worked on parametric insurance with companies in the Norfolk area, the coastal area. The Middle Peninsula PDC has been trying to get parametric insurance there. So we don't have it in Virginia yet, running everywhere, but we're hoping that at some point it can come because parametric insurance can provide a much quicker payout to people after a catastrophe. The Community Reinvestment Act is one I wanted to point out to you. It's been around for a long time. It was to try to get, I'm sure you all know, right? To try to get funding into formerly redlined areas to make up for the redlining practices of mortgage lenders. And so they have been modifying the regulations. Banks have to engage in a certain amount of what they call qualifying activities to earn credit. And their performance is reviewed periodically. And they have to have an active presence in those local communities. And so they have been looking at their regulations to allow climate resilience type actions to count. And I think that that's an important new tool. But it's on the private lending side, but it's something to be aware of. We also talk about the Resilient Virginia Revolving Fund. I try to refer as much as possible to the funding source tool of DCRs. I had that one in there because that wasn't included in the last round of the tool. It wasn't fully developed yet. I put in your Coastal Resilience and Trees Fund that Wetlands Watch administers with the VOF. Although I'd like a status report from you all on that because I'm not sure what the status is this round. MC, you can give me that when we're done. And then just some additional innovative ideas, which I'm always open to innovative ideas. So if you all have any that you want to feature, please let me know. So there are some states that are talking about state government subsidized insurance in very flood prone or wildfire prone parts of their states. When the private insurers start backing off and refuse to issue policies any longer in those areas. But those are often talking about doing it in a way that's phased out over a specific number of years. I'm featuring these innovative ideas just because talking about them out in communities might actually get some traction for them. And I've tried to make it clear when we don't have the authority today in Virginia, but these are things that could be considered. And one is we could talk about a community land trust. So anyway, I think and then the final step, step 5 is a simple and short one, which is just implement your plan, but make sure you evaluate it and adjust it as needed and that you funded it. You've staffed that whole thing. You didn't just put it out. It takes staffing to have somebody there to receive the suggestions and the ideas and the edits and to run the whole iterative process. So it takes monitoring and that takes staff time. All right, and I think I came in just about where I'm supposed to, Ian, is that right? For Q&A. So first, I guess I'd like to throw out a question about usability. And I'd like to also have you all comment on what's in here that shouldn't be or what needs to be added. And MC, if you want to give an update on your trees funding.
Yes, let me go ahead and do that. So Wetlands Watch received funding from the Virginia Outdoors Foundation. VOF is a state agency body politic. It's like a quasi-state agency that essentially acts as Virginia's own land trust. And so they hold conservation easements and they own conserved land across the Commonwealth. And they are the largest landholder in Virginia by a lot. So Virginia Outdoors Foundation it's interesting, they receive money every time a land transaction occurs in the state. So when you buy a property, you have to pay a recordation fee. And that recordation fee is usually like $1 with the clerk in the court where the property is located. And that money goes to the Virginia Outdoors Foundation for them to spend on conservation related activities. So we were receiving funding from VOF each year, and we received funding for about 2 years of operations. And when the interest rates, when the Fed raised the interest rates, the property transactions started to decline. And so that funding source was no longer able to sustain the donations to Wetlands Watch to operate the fund on behalf of VOF or Virginia Outdoors Foundation. So we are in a pause of funding for that program, unfortunately. So who knows what's in store for the Fed? No one could possibly predict that now. But if real estate transactions start to pick up in pace, then we'll be able to re-energize that fund. We also have the ability to re-energize it with additional resources, but since the federal funding freeze and uncertainty, that's gone down on our priority decision tree because we're just trying to make sure our staff have resources for their salaries and things like that. So that's
would you prefer, thank you, MC, would you prefer that I remove it or just put the program is currently on pause?
On pause would be super because we do hope and plan to re-engage it. It's been a great opportunity for property owners and other entities, local governments, et cetera, to receive funding to do really important small small scale green infrastructure practices and tree planting. And there's a big gap in funding for those efforts. Some local governments have the ability to fund small projects. And we, of course, have wonderful nonprofit organizations like the Elizabeth River Project and Lynnhaven River Now that offer cost share opportunities. But we do know that it's a big hole that we hope we can help contribute to fill.
Yeah, it was important. So thank you. I'll just put on pause with my fingers crossed that that's temporary. All right, so I haven't been tracking the chat. Should I have been doing that, Ian?
No, I can read questions that are coming through. We have a question from Becky. There seems to be a lot of focus on flooding, tidal, increased storm intensity. Currently in the tools, are there plans to build out aspects related to increased drought?
Thank you. Yes, so we have heat. We talk about heat some in there, as you saw, and have some heat tools. Drought is of increasing importance. Of course, you called that out. Good job, Becky. And we do want to focus on what the state is going to be doing about drought. Unfortunately, I had a NASA grant to work with the state and the tribes to try to look at One Water is what it's called, the integrated water management approach, and that's been put on pause right now by the feds as well. So I'm hoping that something will come out of that grant because it's with Virginia Tech scientists who are trying to make data available about water supply and sources. And so, yes, the answer is I'm hoping that something will come out of that as soon as funding is cleared. But otherwise, if you have anything that is information about drought that you would like to add or see added, please let me know. I would love to hear that.
I can follow up with that. I'm aware that Virginia changed its regional water supply planning process in October of last year. And right now they're kickstarting that regional approach to water supply planning with a whole bunch of different, what do they call RPUs? What does that stand for? Regional Planning Unit meetings that are
Yes.
supposed to kick off before April 7th of this year. I'm gonna put a link in the chat.
Well, they keep poor things having to cancel them for the weather.
Right.
Mother Nature's not cooperative. But you know, that's a very important shift in the state because, you know, regional water supply planning was voluntary before, and the law got changed to require a more regional approach, which is terrific from a water perspective. And yeah, so they got the regulations adopted and they're just kicking it off. So I could add, that's a great point. I could add just a blurb about that. And the goal of the NASA grant actually was to try to incorporate tribal voices into that water supply planning effort, since we now have 7 sovereign nations in our midst. And so I was hoping to be able to add something on that, but I can go ahead and just, you're exactly right, add that regional plan units.
Definitely. And Becky followed up saying, thank you. It will have wide-ranging impacts on fish and wildlife habitats. That inspires me. What about wildlife crossings and aquatic organism passage? Do you think that could also be incorporated in this guide?
Yes, and we do talk about wildlife crossings at one point, but yes, wildlife crossings are important in that it provides, it's a double benefit, right? It reduces the wildlife impacts, but it also can provide some additional habitat and habitat connections. So if you all have a suggestion about where's a good place to put that, I think I put that under infrastructure. But is there another place? Virginia Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, says Becky. Good, thank you.
And yeah, include reference to the Virginia Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. I think it came out in 2023.
Yep,
Thanks, Becky.
thank you.
Any other questions for Elizabeth? Or, you know, she's looking for feedback. So any anything that strikes you as really helpful as a potential end user of this resource? Anything that's missing, like the drought issue? This is a casual convo. You can come off of mute, show your face or not, but we'd love to hear from folks.
And I changed screens as a prompt to say, again, are there things that should be said right up front that I need to add if this is going to be helpful? Are there things that you encounter that you really wish, oh, I wish I could send my elected officials that change over and they're new and I want to, introduce these concepts to them, or community leaders who want to learn more. I wish there was one place I could send them for one-stop shopping. Is there something that would be helpful to add in here?
I guess I can share something I learned recently that I was unaware of was in the Virginia Public Procurement Act. A public body may purchase from another public body's contract anything with stream restoration and stormwater management practices. And so if contracting was a hurdle for a locality, there are exemptions that allow a locality to use the contract of another locality and pull that over. And that was from Resilient Virginia. Let me share their doc.
Do you
Oh,
mind
we've got,
sending me that link?
Ian's got the link, and we'll send you the chat.
Ah, thank
We do have some good commentary that's coming in. Some questions. Frank Polster says that on the water issue, consider adding Virginia State Water Resources Plan, a report of Virginia's water resources from January 2022. And it has a
Right.
whole climate change chapter.
And which I'm so glad to see, because you're talking about the DEQ Water Resources Plan report, right? Because back when I was at DEQ, it did not have a climate change chapter. So folks, there's progress right there. Because I used to do water policy at DEQ. So that's Jessica McIntosh has asked a great question.
Yeah.
Do you have any info on economic costs of inaction, like cost savings from stricter building codes? Please send that to me if you haven't. We did a study, back when I was at the Coastal Policy Center at William Mary Law School, we did a study in 2016 called The Cost of Doing Nothing. And it was about how much more is sea level rise going to cost us if it was focused on Hampton Roads, if the Hampton Roads communities do nothing, which clearly is not the case. The HRPDC is doing a lot, but I'm just saying how much more, what's the additional cost? And it was hampered by the fact that the feds, of course, don't share details about infrastructure on bases. So to not have the federal government's facilities included in the report in the Hampton Roads region was really tough, because that's a big component there. But we hired a consulting company out of Raleigh-Durham and did the report, and it's hard to find that kind of cost of doing nothing report. It really is. It's hard to assess that, and it's a really important question because thank you, MC. Because so many communities face that, I think, politically, where the elected officials are like, it's a lot easier to just not do anything and not get caught up in this really tough conversation, and just wait and see. How bad is it going to be? So we've got, predictive data coming out of, I gave the example of the Adapt VA website from VIMS with Wetlands Watch. They do some predictive mapping that's really helpful, but that estimate of cost, what's the impact if we do nothing of inaction, is a really important one. So if you all have done any at the local level, please let me know, because I'd love to showcase it. It's a big lift to do that. I see that Frank Polster also said use case from Raft. Is that you want me to give one now, or do you want me to show you something from the guide? I'm not sure which. I can tell you.
Frank, feel
And
free to come off of mute if you want to clarify your comment.
there's the view. Thank you.
What I was talking about is when you take a look at your planning process, and then you look at the RAF's prep tools, they've been doing this since like 2017, and they've been doing it through a whole bunch of the Middle Peninsula counties and the upper side. And with the documentation that's there, it seems to me that the process that they go through is very similar to what you're proposing. And so the use cases of, let's say, West Point and how they came about putting a resiliency plan, they went and got funding from the state to put a plan together. They used the raft process. They went through the whole community checklist piece. That kind of a use case would resonate with my leadership because it's next door, like, or New Kent County. So that's what I mean about having the sort of use cases that are from the RAFT program.
Thank you. All right, so let me back up and talk about the raft for a moment. So the raft is about a decade old. You're exactly right. We've been doing it a long time. I co-founded it with Tanya Denkla-Cobb at UVA back when I was at William and Mary, Virginia Coastal Policy Center. And ODU came on board as a partner, and we first worked with the Eastern Shore of Virginia, then the Northern Neck, then the Middle Peninsula, just like you said, Frank. And then in Crater, PDC, we worked with Hopewell and Petersburg. Now we're working with Southwest Virginia, 2 counties, Dickinson and Carroll. Wow, just got hit with terrible flooding down there. We're just launching with James City County, Williamsburg, and York County. It's a 3-step process. We start with a RAFT scorecard that we developed for the effort to assess how much resilience is built into a community's programs and policies. And concurrently, we do a qualitative assessment with some focus groups and interviews to get down into the grassroots of the community. And then we pull together representatives. First of all, we present the results of the scoring, which we do with the staff to make sure we do it right. We present it to the elected officials so that everybody knows what's going on and what the score was. Then we hold a regional workshop in partnership with the PDC and present the scorecard results and break up into small groups by locality and present them with a list of opportunities pulled from the comprehensive plan, the hazard mitigation plan, the RAFT scorecard, the results of the qualitative assessment interviews and focus groups, and just give them ideas of things that they could pick to work on over the coming year to become more resilient. And each community picks 3 to 5 things, and then the 3 universities divide up the localities, and we take responsibility for hosting and facilitating monthly online meetings of what we call implementation teams that will work through those 3 to 5 things. I saw Katie on here, I think, Kate Charles, she worked with us back when she was the county on the Eastern Shore. So speak up if you want, Katie. So it does, the goal is to help them to see what their resilience needs are, have a common understanding of their vulnerabilities, and end up with a checklist of things to work on for the year. I would say that the biggest challenge we face, though, is that at the end of that year of implementation, so it's about an 18-month process, right? 6 months to score and present the results to the elected officials, and we hold the workshop, and we do a year of implementation team meetings. When we get to the end, the resources just aren't there in the local government a lot of times to take over and handle that kind of monthly meeting and keeping the ball moving. We have started suggesting to localities that one of their resilience checklist items should be to form a resilience committee to keep the work going after the RAF leaves. But even then, we get to the end of the year, and a few communities that had adopted that as one of their items and they pulled together a resilience committee will say, okay, who on the implementation team wants to continue serving on the resilience committee? And you get a lot of hands. And then you say, and who wants to run it and chair it and facilitate? And everybody's sitting on their hands because nobody has time. And so I think that's it's a jump start to resilience planning, but I think for it to continue in these communities, there's got to be state resources that come down, whether it's, the Chief Resilience Officer's office, they have 1 new employee, and I think the other position's still advertised. I'm not sure. Has that been filled? Mary Carson, I can't remember. And so some kind of resource to support communities.
Our board supervisors in James City County finally approved going after the community flood program to put a resiliency plan together. And so they've taken that step. And so if you're going to do a raft for York, James City County, I think maybe the timing may be right to marry the 2 together.
Thank you. In fact, that's what staff said. They said it's actually perfect timing. And what I love is that the HRPDC, Ben McFarland, the CRO, pointed out this is perfect timing to also layer in with hazard mitigation plan updating and with the Norfolk, the course coastal risk study. So I'm hoping all these elements can actually come together and be, sorry, overused word, but kind of synergistic and work together to increase resilience. Trying to just pull all of these resources into one spot to make the most out of them because our community's staffs are so under-resourced.
Last comment is, in January, the Hampton Roads Planning District finally published a set of guidance for sea level rise, and with some different figures in there that'll take care of the shortfalls of Atlas 14 in it. Can you comment on those proposed standards that they're talking about, planning standards for sea level rise?
Well, I think personally it's terrific. It's proactive. It's what we need. You know, the HRPDC has been proactive in a lot of ways on trying to plan for this, including, I didn't show you, there's a case study I did about them and about the parking lots and trying to look at flipping to more pervious cover to reduce the stormwater runoff, to reduce the flooding. So if a region can come together in a consensus manner like that to develop sea level rise resilient standards, then that's terrific. You know, that helps to overcome that issue I mentioned earlier about the independent cities and how hard it is to regionally do things together. The PDC is a great mechanism to achieve that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope we get to work with you on the RAP since we're starting in James City County. Didn't you say James City County, was it planning commissioner?
Yeah, I am a planning commissioner.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. If anybody has ideas that they come up with later about how to use this, I'm going to be presenting, I should say, again, Wetlands Watch gets the extra yay, because this is the first one, but I'm going to be presenting it at the HRPDC Regional Environmental Committee and to the Rappahannock River Basin Commission's Technical Committee. So I'm just trying to get the word out to see how it's the most useful to people. So please don't hesitate to fill out this contact form later if you think of things as you go through it. Thanks, Becky.
Isabella asked, is RAFT applicable to communities more inland or for coastal communities? She is in the Charlottesville area.
Yes. Yay. Yes, we are working with Dickinson and Carroll right now. We finished up with Hopewell and Petersburg that are a little more inland than coastal. But also we got an EPA grant to work with 10 other Southwestern Virginia communities. And so we're waiting to see if that happens or not right now. So fingers crossed, yes, it should be happening.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you all.